The courthouse buzzed with nervous energy as dozens of people waited in the hallway outside courtroom 7. Among them sat 8-year-old Tommy Martinez, swinging his legs from the wooden bench while his mother, Sarah, clutched his small hand tightly. She had never imagined that bringing her son to testify would lead to one of the most shocking revelations in the court's history. 3 months earlier, Tommy had been playing in Riverside Park when he witnessed something that would change everything. It was a sunny Tuesday afternoon, and Sarah had taken him to the playground after his dental appointment. While she sat on a nearby bench making phone calls for work, Tommy climbed the tall jungle gym that offered a perfect view of the entire park. From his perch high above the playground, Tommy watched the usual afternoon crowd. Joggers followed the winding path around the lake. Elderly couples fed ducks from the wooden bridge, and other children played on swings and slides. Everything seemed perfectly normal until Tommy noticed a man in a dark uniform walking quickly toward the parking lot. The man moved differently from everyone else in the park. His steps were precise and purposeful, almost military-like. Tommy had always been fascinated by soldiers and police officers, often spending hours watching documentaries about different uniforms and ranks with his grandfather, a retired Army sergeant. Something about this particular man caught his attention immediately. The uniformed figure stopped near a black sedan and looked around nervously before opening the trunk. Tommy squinted in the afternoon sunlight, trying to get a better look at what was happening. The man pulled out a large duffel bag and placed it carefully on the ground. Then he did something that made Tommy's heart race with excitement and confusion. The man began removing his uniform piece by piece, folding each item neatly before placing it in the duffel bag. Underneath, he wore regular civilian clothes, jeans, and a plain white t-shirt. Tommy watched in fascination as the transformation continued. The man removed what appeared to be a ceremonial hat with gold braiding and placed it carefully in the bag along with polished black boots and white gloves. What happened next made Tommy gasp audibly. The man pulled out a completely different set of clothes from another bag in his trunk, a maintenance worker's uniform with a name tag that Tommy couldn't read from his distance. Within minutes, the same person who had looked like an important military or security officer now appeared to be an ordinary park maintenance worker. The newly disguised man walked to a nearby maintenance shed, unlocked it with a key, and disappeared inside. Tommy waited patiently, his young mind racing with questions about what he had just witnessed. Why would someone need to change clothes like that? Was this person playing some kind of game? Or was something more serious happening? After about 20 minutes, the man emerged from the shed pushing a lawnmower. He began cutting grass in a section of the park far from where Tommy sat, acting as if he had been working there all along. Tommy noticed that other park visitors paid no attention to the maintenance worker, treating him as invisible as most people do with service workers. Tommy's mother finished her phone calls and approached the playground. "Time to go home, sweetheart," she called out. As they walked toward their car, Tommy kept looking back at the maintenance worker, trying to memorize his face and build. Something deep in his gut told him this was important, even though he couldn't understand why. That evening at dinner, Tommy told his mother about the strange man in the park. Sarah listened patiently, assuming her son had an active imagination running wild again. Tommy often created elaborate stories about ordinary events, turning mundane encounters into exciting adventures. She smiled and nodded, encouraging his creativity while not taking the story too seriously. However, Tommy's grandfather, who was visiting for dinner, paid closer attention to the boy's description. The retired sergeant had trained young soldiers for decades and recognized genuine observation skills when he heard them. Tommy described details that most children wouldn't notice: the way the man held his shoulders, the specific type of buttons on the uniform, and the methodical way he folded each piece of clothing. "What kind of uniform was it exactly?" his grandfather asked, setting down his fork and focusing intently on Tommy's words. Tommy closed his eyes, trying to remember every detail. It was dark blue with shiny buttons. The hat had gold stuff on, hit like the guards I've seen in those castle movies you show me. And he had white gloves that went up past his wrists. Oh, and there was a badge or something on his chest, but I couldn't see what it said. The grandfather's expression grew serious. The description sounded remarkably similar to a ceremonial guard uniform, possibly even a royal guard uniform from one of the palaces he had visited during his military service years ago. But what would someone wearing such a uniform be doing in a public park? And why would they need to disguise themselves as a maintenance worker? 2 weeks later, Sarah was watching the evening news when a breaking story caught her attention. The reporter announced that several valuable items had been stolen from the royal palace during a private ceremony attended by dignitaries from around the world. Security footage showed someone in a maintenance uniform accessing restricted areas during the event, but the person's face was never clearly visible. Sarah's heart began racing as she remembered Tommy's story about the man changing clothes in the park. She called her father immediately, explaining what she had just heard on the news. The grandfather's military instincts kicked in, and he advised Sarah to contact the police with Tommy's information. Within hours, detectives arrived at their home to interview Tommy. Initially skeptical about the reliability of a child witness, they quickly became intrigued by the level of detail in his account. Tommy drew pictures of the uniform pieces he remembered and described the exact location in the park where the incident occurred. The investigation team visited Riverside Park and discovered that the maintenance shed Tommy had mentioned was indeed used to store equipment, but it also provided perfect access to a service tunnel that connected to several important buildings downtown, including a government facility that housed visiting dignitaries and their security details. As the investigation expanded, detectives realized they might have stumbled upon something much larger than a simple theft case. Detective Maria Rodriguez had worked complex cases for 15 years, but nothing had prepared her for the investigation that began with a child's observation in a public park. After interviewing Tommy Martinez and visiting the location he described, she knew this case was far more serious than anyone initially realized. The theft at the royal palace had shocked the entire security establishment. During a private ceremony honoring international peacekeepers, someone had managed to steal several priceless artifacts from a supposedly secure display room. The stolen items included a ceremonial sword dating back 3 centuries, a diamond-encrusted Medal of Honor, and historical documents signed by past monarchs. Palace security had been considered impenetrable. Every guard underwent extensive background checks, psychological evaluations, and continuous monitoring. The fact that someone had breached these defenses using a maintenance worker disguise suggested either an inside job or someone with intimate knowledge of palace operations. Detective Rodriguez assembled a task force that included specialists in art theft, palace security, and fraud investigation. They began by examining every maintenance worker who had access to the palace during the ceremony. Background checks revealed nothing suspicious, but Tommy's testimony suggested they were looking for someone who was pretending to be a maintenance worker, not an actual employee. The team decided to set up surveillance around Riverside Park, hoping the perpetrator might return to the location Tommy had described. They installed hidden cameras near the maintenance shed and along the walking paths, while undercover officers posed as joggers and dog walkers during peak hours. Meanwhile, forensic specialists examined the maintenance shed Tommy had identified. Using advanced fingerprint technology, they discovered partial prints on the lock mechanism and door handle that didn't match any authorized maintenance personnel. The shed also contained trace evidence, microscopic fibers from what appeared to be high-quality uniform fabric, the kind used in ceremonial dress rather than work clothes. As the investigation deepened, Detective Rodriguez began studying the guest list from the palace ceremony. Over 200 people had attended, including diplomats, military officers, and members of various royal guards from friendly nations. Each attendee had been thoroughly vetted, but the detective wondered if someone had used the event as cover for their criminal activities. The breakthrough came when the forensics team analyzed security footage from the palace more carefully. While the thief's face remained hidden throughout the robbery, careful frame-by-frame analysis revealed something crucial. In one brief moment, as the person reached for the ceremonial sword, their sleeve pulled back slightly, exposing a distinctive tattoo on their wrist. The tattoo was small, but unique, an intricate design featuring a crown surrounded by crossed swords. Detective Rodriguez immediately contacted military databases and palace personnel records, searching for anyone with this specific marking. Within days, the search yielded a shocking result. The tattoo belonged to Captain James Fletcher, a decorated member of the Royal Guard who had served with distinction for over 12 years. Fletcher had been present at the ceremony, but not as part of the security detail. He was attending as a guest, having recently received a commendation for his service in protecting visiting dignitaries during several high-profile events. Detective Rodriguez stared at Fletcher's personnel file in disbelief. His record was spotless. Commendations for bravery, perfect performance reviews, and glowing recommendations from superior officers. There was no indication of financial problems, criminal associations, or any other red flags that typically preceded such dramatic criminal behavior. However, a deeper investigation into Fletcher's recent activities revealed some concerning patterns. Over the past 6 months, he had made several large cash deposits into his bank account, totaling nearly $50,000. When questioned by bank security during routine monitoring, Fletcher had explained these deposits as payments for freelance security consulting work. The investigation team also discovered that Fletcher had been spending unusual amounts of time studying palace layouts and security procedures, claiming he was preparing for a promotion exam. His access to detailed floor plans and security protocols would have given him the knowledge needed to plan the perfect heist. Detective Rodriguez faced a delicate situation. Accusing a decorated royal guard of theft without absolute proof could destroy an innocent man's career and reputation. However, the evidence was mounting, and Tommy's testimony provided a crucial link between Fletcher and the crime scene. The team decided to conduct covert surveillance of Fletcher while building their case. They watched his daily routines, monitored his communications, and tracked his movements during off-duty hours. What they discovered painted a picture of a man living beyond his means and possibly involved in activities that extended far beyond a single theft. Fletcher had been frequenting expensive restaurants, purchasing luxury items, and even looking at properties well outside his salary range. More troubling, surveillance revealed several meetings with individuals known to be involved in black market art dealing and international smuggling operations. As the investigation continued, Detective Rodriguez realized they weren't dealing with an isolated incident. The palace theft might be part of a larger criminal network that used Fletcher's position and knowledge to target high-value items from secure locations around the world. The evidence was compelling, but Detective Rodriguez knew that bringing charges against a royal guard would require overwhelming proof. The case would face intense scrutiny from media, palace officials, and the legal system. One mistake could not only jeopardize the prosecution, but also compromise ongoing investigations into the broader criminal network. The decision was made to present the case to a grand jury, with Tommy's testimony serving as a key piece of evidence, linking Fletcher to the maintenance shed and the disguise operation. However, prosecutors worried about relying too heavily on the observations of an 8-year-old child, despite the remarkable accuracy of his account. To strengthen their case, investigators worked tirelessly to find additional evidence. They analyzed Fletcher's phone records, searched his residence with a warrant, and interviewed everyone who had interacted with him around the time of the theft. Each piece of evidence added another layer to the prosecution's argument, but they still needed something more definitive. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that Fletcher had purchased maintenance uniforms from a specialty supplier 3 weeks before the palace ceremony. The supplier remembered the unusual order because Fletcher had paid cash and requested specific sizing that didn't match standard maintenance worker requirements. With this evidence, along with the fingerprints from the shed, the tattoo identification, and Tommy's detailed testimony, prosecutors felt confident enough to proceed with formal charges. The case would go to trial, where Tommy would face the daunting task of testifying before a judge and jury about what he had witnessed in Riverside Park. The courtroom preparation sessions were unlike anything Tommy Martinez had ever experienced. Child psychologist Dr. Jennifer Walsh worked patiently with the 8-year-old, helping him understand what would happen when he testified and preparing him for the intense questioning he would face. "Remember, Tommy," Dr. Walsh said during one of their sessions, Just tell the truth about what you saw. Don't worry about anything else. She had worked with child witnesses in dozens of cases, but rarely had she encountered a young person with such clear memories and attention to detail. Tommy's mother, Sarah, struggled with conflicting emotions about her son's involvement in such a high-profile case. She was proud that his sharp observations might help solve a serious crime, but she worried about the pressure and media attention surrounding the trial. The case had attracted international interest, with reporters from around the world following. Every development, Captain James Fletcher maintained his innocence throughout the legal proceedings. His defense attorney, Marcus Thornfield, argued that the prosecution's case relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of a child whose imagination might have transformed an innocent encounter into something more sinister. My client is a decorated officer with 12 years of distinguished service, Thornfield argued during pretrial hearings. The prosecution expects you to believe that this honorable man threw away his career and reputation based on the observations of an 8-year-old child playing in a park. However, prosecutor Linda Chen had built a compelling case that went far beyond Tommy's testimony. The fingerprints, the tattoo identification, the suspicious financial deposits, and the purchase of maintenance uniforms created a web of evidence that was difficult to explain away. The trial began on a gray Monday morning in October. Judge Harrison Blackwood, known for his careful handling of complex cases, presided over proceedings that would determine Fletcher's fate and potentially expose a much larger criminal conspiracy. Tommy's grandfather attended every day of the trial, providing moral support for his grandson, while also serving as an expert witness about military uniforms and protocols. His years of experience training soldiers gave him unique insights into the significance of the details Tommy had observed. During opening statements, Prosecutor Chen laid out the timeline of events, beginning with Tommy's observation in the park and ending with the palace theft. She used charts and photographs to illustrate how Fletcher's access to palace security information, combined with his knowledge of guard protocols, made the crime possible. The defendant exploited his position of trust, Chen told the jury. He used his intimate knowledge of palace operations to plan and execute a carefully orchestrated theft, thinking that his disguise and his reputation would protect him from suspicion. Defense attorney Thornfield countered by questioning the reliability of the evidence and suggesting that Fletcher was being framed by the real criminals. He pointed out that the fingerprints found in the maintenance shed were partial and could belong to anyone who had handled the lock or door over the years. The prosecution wants you to destroy a good man's life based on speculation and the overactive imagination of a child, Thornfield argued. Captain Fletcher has dedicated his life to protecting others, and now he needs your protection from false accusations. The first week of testimony focused on technical evidence. Forensics experts explained how they had analyzed the fingerprints, traced the purchase of maintenance uniforms, and connected Fletcher to the crime scene. Palace security officials described the sophisticated planning required to carry out the theft without detection. Bank officials testified about Fletcher's unusual cash deposits, while art theft specialists explained the international market for stolen royal artifacts. Each piece of testimony added weight to the prosecution's case, but Thornfield skillfully challenged every detail, suggesting alternative explanations and raising questions about investigative procedures. The courtroom. Atmosphere grew tense as the trial approached its most crucial phase. Tommy's testimony. Media coverage intensified, with reporters speculating about how an 8-year-old's words might determine the fate of a decorated royal guard. Dr. Walsh had prepared Tommy for the pressure he would face, but nothing could fully simulate the experience of sitting in a witness chair while dozens of people watched his every word. The judge took special precautions to protect the young witness, limiting photography and requiring respectful behavior from all attendees. When Tommy took the stand, he looked small and vulnerable in the large courtroom chair. However, his voice was clear and confident as Prosecutor Chen began her questioning. Step by step, Tommy recounted what he had seen in Riverside Park, describing the man in the ceremonial uniform and the careful way he had changed into maintenance worker clothes. Can you tell us about the uniform the man was wearing? Chen asked gently. Tommy closed his eyes briefly, just as he had done when describing the scene to his grandfather months earlier. It was dark blue with shiny buttons that looked like gold. The hat had gold braiding around the edges, and there were white gloves that came up high on his arms. The courtroom remained silent as Tommy continued his description, providing details that matched exactly with Royal Guard ceremonial uniforms. He described the precise way the man had folded each piece of clothing and the military-style movements that had caught his attention from the playground. Defense attorney Thornfield approached his cross-examination carefully, knowing that aggressive questioning of a child witness could backfire with the jury. Instead, he focused on the distance between the playground and the parking area, the lighting conditions that afternoon, and the possibility that Tommy might have confused details or embellished his memories over time. "Tommy, you were quite far away from the man you saw, weren't you?" Thornfield asked kindly. "Yes, sir, but I have really good eyes," Tommy replied earnestly. "My mom says I notice things that other people miss." Thornfield tried several approaches to cast doubt on Tommy's observations, but the boy remained consistent in his account. When asked to point out the man he had seen in the courtroom, Tommy studied the faces carefully before pointing directly at Captain Fletcher. "That's him," Tommy said with quiet certainty. "He looks different without the uniform, but that's the same man I saw in the park." The moment electrified the courtroom. Fletcher's face remained impassive, but several jurors leaned forward in their seats, studying both Tommy and the defendant intently. Murmurs rippled through the gallery until Judge Blackwood called for order. Thornfield made one final attempt to undermine Tommy's identification. "Tommy, you've seen Captain Fletcher's photograph in the newspapers and on television many times over the past few months, haven't you?" "Yes, sir," Tommy admitted. "Isn't it possible that you're identifying him now because you've seen his picture? So many times, not because you actually saw him in the park?" Tommy considered the question carefully before answering. "No, sir. I remember his face from the park. When I saw his picture on TV later, I told my mom that was the same man. She didn't believe me at first." The prosecution rested its case after Tommy's testimony, confident that the combination of physical evidence and the boy's compelling identification had proven Fletcher's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The defense phase of the trial began with Captain Fletcher's character witnesses taking the stand. Fellow guards, commanding officers, and even some of the dignitaries he had protected testified about his impeccable service record and unwavering dedication to duty. Each witness painted a picture of a man who would never betray the trust placed in him. Colonel William Hartley, Fletcher's former commanding officer, spoke passionately about the defendant's character. "In 25 years of military service, I have never met a more honorable or trustworthy officer than James Fletcher," he testified. "The idea that he would steal from the very institution he has sworn to protect is simply inconceivable," a defensio. Attorney Thornfield used these testimonies to build an alternative narrative. He suggested that Fletcher was being framed by a sophisticated criminal organization that had studied his routines and chosen him as the perfect fall guy. A decorated guard with access to palace security would make an ideal scapegoat, especially if the real criminals could plant evidence linking him to the crime. The defense also called financial experts who questioned the prosecution's interpretation of Fletcher's bank deposits. They argued that the amounts and timing were consistent with legitimate consulting work, pointing out that security specialists often earned substantial fees for private assignments during their off-duty hours. However, Prosecutor Chen had prepared for these arguments. During cross-examination, she pressed the character witnesses about their knowledge of Fletcher's recent activities and financial situation. Most admitted they had not maintained close contact with him in recent months and were unaware of his consulting work or increased spending. The prosecution also presented evidence that contradicted the defense's framing theory. Cell phone records showed Fletcher in the vicinity of Riverside Park at the exact time Tommy claimed to have witnessed the uniform change. Additionally, traffic cameras captured images of Fletcher's vehicle entering and leaving the park area during the relevant time frame. Dr. Patricia Newman, a forensic psychologist specializing in memory and witness reliability, testified about Tommy's testimony. She had evaluated the boy's cognitive abilities and interviewed him extensively about his observations. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Newman told the court. Tommy Martinez demonstrates exceptional observational skills and memory retention for a child his age. His account has remained consistent throughout multiple interviews, and he shows no signs of false memory syndrome or suggestibility that might indicate his testimony was influenced by external factors. The defense countered with their own expert witness, child psychologist Dr. Robert Hayes, who argued that young children often confuse details and can be influenced by media coverage and adult expectations. He cited studies showing that children's memories are particularly susceptible to contamination when they become the focus of intense adult attention.
While I don't question Tommy's honesty, Dr. Hayes testified, children his age naturally want to please adults and may unconsciously alter their memories to match what they believe others want to hear. The extensive media coverage of this case
could easily have influenced his recollections. As the expert testimony concluded, defense attorney Thornfield faced a crucial decision. He could call Captain Fletcher to the stand to testify in his own defense, or he could rest his case and argue that the prosecution had failed to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Fletcher had repeatedly expressed his desire to testify, insisting that he could convince the jury of his innocence. However, Thornfield worried that Fletcher's testimony might open doors for the prosecution to introduce additional evidence or explore areas that were currently inadmissible. After lengthy consultations, Fletcher made the decision to testify despite his attorney's reservations. He took the stand wearing his dress uniform, presenting the image of a proud and honorable soldier facing false accusations. "I have never stolen anything in my life," Fletcher testified with quiet dignity. "My service record speaks for itself. I have dedicated my career to protecting others, and I would never betray the trust that has been placed in me." Fletcher explained his presence in Riverside Park on the day in question, claiming he had gone there for a run as part of his regular fitness routine. He denied changing clothes or owning maintenance uniforms, suggesting that Tommy had either seen someone else or had confused details in his memory. "I feel sorry for the boy," Fletcher said, looking directly at Tommy, who was sitting in the gallery with his mother. "He's obviously intelligent and observant, but he's mistaken about what he saw that day." Under direct examination, Fletcher came across as sincere and believable. He answered questions about his finances, explaining that his consulting income came from legitimate security assessments for private companies. He provided documentation for several contracts and testimonials from satisfied clients. However, the cross-examination proved devastating. Prosecutor Chen had done her homework, and she systematically dismantled Fletcher's explanations with precision and patience. She presented evidence that several of his supposed consulting clients didn't exist or had no record of hiring him for security work. "Captain Fletcher," Chen said, holding up bank records, "you claim this $15,000 deposit came from a security consultation for Meridian Industries. However, Meridian Industries has no record of any contract with you. In fact, they've never heard of you. How do you explain this discrepancy?" Fletcher's composure began to crack as Chen continued her methodical examination. She presented evidence of fictitious contracts, forged documents, and false invoices that Fletcher had apparently created to explain his mysterious income sources. The most damaging moment came when Chen confronted Fletcher with surveillance footage from a high-end art dealer's establishment. The video, previously unknown to the defense, showed Fletcher meeting with known black market dealers just 2 weeks after the Palace theft. "Can you explain why you were meeting with Marcus Volkov, a man with multiple convictions for trafficking?" "Stolen art?" Chen asked. Fletcher's face went pale as he stared at the images on the courtroom monitor. He stammered several responses before finally claiming he didn't remember the meeting and suggesting the footage might have been doctored. The prosecution's rebuttal case was brief but powerful. They called Detective Rodriguez to explain how the Yamaing investigation had uncovered Fletcher's connections to an international art theft ring. The network specialized in recruiting insiders from museums, palaces, and private collections to steal high-value items for wealthy collectors. According to the detective's testimony, Fletcher had been approached by the organization months before the palace ceremony. They offered him substantial payments for information about security procedures and access routes. The palace theft was intended to be his first active participation in an actual crime, with the promise of much larger payments. for future cooperation. Captain Fletcher wasn't just stealing artifacts, Detective Rodriguez explained. He was selling out the security of every location he had access to. We found evidence that he had already provided detailed information about 3 other potential targets. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Fletcher wasn't just a decorated guard who had made a single terrible mistake. He was an active participant in a criminal conspiracy that threatened cultural treasures around the world. As the prosecution concluded its rebuttal case, the weight of evidence against Fletcher seemed overwhelming. Tommy's initial observation in the park had unraveled a criminal network that extended far beyond a single theft. The boy's sharp eyes and excellent memory had not only identified a thief, but exposed a much larger threat to cultural institutions everywhere. Judge Blackwood announced that closing arguments would begin the following morning, setting the stage for the final phase of a trial that had captivated international attention and transformed a child's playground observation into a landmark case against art theft and institutional corruption. The courtroom was packed to capacity as closing arguments began. News crews from around the world waited outside, while inside, the fate of Captain James Fletcher hung in the balance. Tommy Martinez sat between his mother and grandfather, the weight of his testimony having transformed him from an ordinary child into the key witness in one of the most significant art theft cases in recent history. Defense attorney Marcus Thornfield rose first, making a final passionate plea for his client's innocence. He walked slowly before the jury, his voice filled with conviction as he challenged every piece of evidence the prosecution had presented. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Thornfield began, "the prosecution wants you to believe that a decorated officer with 12 years of unblemished service suddenly decided to throw away his career, his honor, and his freedom for money. They want you to convict Captain Fletcher based primarily on the testimony of an 8-year-old child who was playing hundreds of feet away from the alleged incident." Thornfield systematically addressed each element of the prosecution's case, arguing that the fingerprints could have been left innocently during any of Fletcher's legitimate visits to the park area. He suggested that the financial evidence was circumstantial, and that the surveillance footage showing Fletcher with art dealers was ambiguous at best. "The prosecution has built a house of cards," he continued. "Remove any single piece of their circumstantial evidence and the entire case collapses. They have not proven beyond reasonable doubt that Captain Fletcher committed these crimes. They have simply found a convenient scapegoat for crimes committed by the real criminals who remain free." Thornfield reserved his strongest criticism for the prosecution's reliance on Tommy's testimony. While acknowledging the boy's obvious intelligence and sincerity, he argued that children's memories are inherently unreliable, especially when subjected to months of adult attention and media coverage. "Young Tommy Martinez is clearly a bright, observant child," Thornfield said, glancing kindly at Tommy. "But children see the world differently than adults. They fill in gaps in their memory with imagination. They want to please the adults around them." Over the months since his initial statement, Tommy has been interviewed dozens of times, has seen Captain Fletcher's photograph in newspapers and on television, and has been praised repeatedly for his good memory. "Is it any wonder that he now believes he saw my client in that park?" The defense attorney concluded by reminding the jury of Fletcher's exemplary service record and the testimony of colleagues who vouched for his character. He asked them to consider whether they were truly convinced beyond reasonable doubt or whether they were simply being swept along by the drama of a child witness and circumstantial evidence. Prosecutor Linda Chen approached her closing argument with quiet confidence. She had built her case methodically, and she intended to dismantle the defense's arguments with the same precision she had used throughout the trial. "Members of the jury," Chen began, "the defense wants you to believe that this is all an incredible coincidence. They want you to believe that Tommy Martinez just happened to imagine seeing someone change from a Royal Guard uniform into maintenance clothes in the exact location where we found the defendant's fingerprints. They want you to believe that Captain Fletcher just happened to make mysterious cash deposits totaling $50,000 at the same time priceless artifacts were being stolen. They want you to believe that he just happened to meet with known art thieves by pure chance." Chen walked the jury through the timeline of evidence, showing how each piece fit perfectly with the others to create a complete picture of Fletcher's guilt. She displayed photographs of the stolen artifacts alongside images of the maintenance shed, where Tommy had seen the uniform change, emphasizing the physical connections between Fletcher and the crime scene. The defense has attacked Tommy Martinez's credibility because he's 8 years old, Chen continued, her voice growing stronger. But age doesn't determine reliability. Tommy's account has never wavered. He described details about Royal Guard uniforms that most adults wouldn't notice. He identified the defendant without hesitation, despite months passing between his observation and the identification. The prosecutor addressed the defense's framing theory directly, pointing out that it would have required criminals with intimate knowledge of Fletcher's daily routines, access to his fingerprints, and the ability to manipulate bank records and surveillance footage. Such an elaborate conspiracy was far less plausible than the simple explanation that Fletcher was exactly what he appeared to be: a corrupt guard who had betrayed his oath for money. Chen saved her most powerful argument for last, revealing additional evidence that had emerged during Fletcher's cross-examination. Investigators had discovered that Fletcher had made detailed sketches of security layouts for 3 other cultural institutions, sketches that had been found in the possession of arrested art thieves in 2 different countries. This case began with a child's sharp observation in a public park, Chen told the jury. But it has revealed something much more sinister: a systematic betrayal of trust that threatened cultural treasures around the world. Captain Fletcher didn't just steal artifacts. He sold out the security of every institution he was sworn to protect. The prosecutor concluded by reminding the jury that their verdict would send a message about society's commitment to protecting cultural heritage and holding trusted officials accountable for their actions. She asked them to trust the evidence, trust Tommy's testimony, and find Fletcher guilty on all charges. Judge Blackwood provided detailed jury instructions, explaining the legal standards for each charge and the meaning of proof beyond reasonable doubt. He emphasized that the jury must base their decision solely on the evidence presented during the trial, not on media coverage or personal feelings about the case. As the jury retired to deliberate, speculation filled the courtroom about how long they might take to reach a verdict. Complex cases with extensive evidence often required days of discussion, but the clarity of the evidence and Tommy's compelling testimony suggested that deliberations might be shorter than expected. Tommy and his family waited anxiously in a private room provided by court officials. The boy seemed surprisingly calm, having done his part and now trusting in the justice system to reach the right conclusion. His mother and grandfather discussed the trial proceedings in quiet voices, both proud of Tommy's courage and hoping that his testimony would help convict the man who had betrayed his position of trust. Detective Rodriguez and the prosecution team used the waiting time to review their files and prepare for potential appeals. They were confident in their case but knew that Fletcher's conviction would likely be challenged at higher court levels. The international implications of the art theft network meant that other law enforcement agencies were watching the outcome closely. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury sent word that they had reached a verdict. Court officials quickly contacted all parties, and within 30 minutes the courtroom was filled once again with reporters, spectators, and the key figures whose lives had been changed by events that began with a child's observation in a public park. Judge Blackwood called for order as the jury foreman stood to announce their decision. The moment of truth had arrived, and Tommy Martinez's testimony was about to be validated or rejected by 12 citizens who had carefully weighed every piece of evidence in one of the most unusual cases in the court's history. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited to learn whether justice would be served and whether a young boy's sharp eyes had truly identified a criminal who had hidden behind a uniform of honor and trust. The courtroom fell silent as jury foreman Michael Harrison stood to deliver the verdict that would determine Captain Fletcher's fate. Tommy Martinez squeezed his mother's hand tightly, his 8-year-old heart racing with anticipation. After months of investigation, weeks of testimony, and hours of deliberation, the moment of truth had finally arrived. On the charge of theft of cultural artifacts, Harrison announced in a clear, steady voice, "We find the defendant guilty." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Sarah Martinez felt tears welling in her eyes as she realized her son's testimony had been believed and validated. Fletcher's face remained stoic, but his shoulders sagged slightly as the weight of the verdict settled upon him. On the charge of conspiracy to commit theft, Harrison continued, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of breach of trust by a public official, we find the defendant guilty. Judge Blackwood maintained order as murmurs spread throughout the gallery. Fletcher's defense attorney placed a supportive hand on his client's shoulder while Prosecutor Chen allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. The jury had spoken unanimously on all charges, sending a clear message about their confidence in the evidence. After the formal verdict was recorded, Judge Blackwood scheduled sentencing for the following month, allowing time for pre-sentence investigations and impact statements. Fletcher was remanded to custody pending sentencing. His distinguished career officially ended by the testimony of a child who had simply been playing in a park on a sunny afternoon. Outside the courthouse, media representatives surrounded Tommy and his family, eager for interviews and reactions. However, Sarah Martinez had prepared for this moment, working with court officials to protect her son from excessive attention while still acknowledging the historic significance of his role in the case. Tommy did what any good citizen should do, Sarah told reporters. He told the truth about what he saw. We're grateful that the jury believed in his testimony and that justice has been served. Tommy himself seemed more interested in the ice cream his grandfather had promised him than in the media frenzy surrounding the verdict. When one reporter asked how it felt to help solve such an important case, Tommy's response was characteristically straightforward. I just told everyone what I saw, he said simply. My grandpa always says that telling the truth is important, even when it's scary. The conviction sent shockwaves through law enforcement and security communities worldwide. Detective Rodriguez found herself fielding calls from investigators in 6 different countries, all dealing with cases potentially connected to the international art theft network that Fletcher had been part of. Within weeks of the verdict, arrests were made in London, Paris, and New York, as authorities dismantled the criminal organization that had recruited Fletcher. The network had been operating for over 5 years, stealing artifacts worth millions of dollars from museums, private collections, and cultural institutions across 3 continents. The stolen royal artifacts were eventually recovered from a private collector in Switzerland who claimed to have purchased them through legitimate channels. The priceless items were returned to their rightful place in the palace, where new security measures were implemented based on lessons learned from Fletcher's betrayal. Fletcher's sentencing hearing drew another crowd of spectators and media representatives. The prosecution presented evidence of the full scope of his criminal activities, including detailed plans he had provided for potential thefts at a dozen other locations. Victim impact statements came from museum directors, cultural preservation experts, and security professionals whose trust had been violated by Fletcher's actions. The defense asked for leniency, citing Fletcher's years of honorable service and arguing that he had been manipulated by sophisticated criminals who exploited his financial difficulties. Character witnesses again testified about the good man they had known, expressing shock and disappointment at his fall from grace. Judge Blackwood sentenced Fletcher to 15 years in prison, noting that positions of trust carry special responsibilities, and that betraying that trust demands serious consequences. The sentence was longer than many had expected, reflecting the judge's concern about the broader implications of Fletcher's crimes for cultural security worldwide. Captain Fletcher's actions didn't just result in the theft of priceless artifacts, Judge Blackwood stated during sentencing. They represented a fundamental betrayal of the trust placed in those who protect our cultural heritage. The sentence must reflect not only the specific crimes committed, but also the broader damage to public confidence in our security institutions. Tommy Martinez was not present for the sentencing, his parents having decided that the conviction was closure enough for their family. Instead, he was back in school where his classmates had initially treated him like a celebrity, before gradually returning to normal childhood concerns about homework, playground games, and weekend activities. The case had a lasting impact on security procedures at cultural institutions around the world. The Martinez Protocol became standard practice at many museums and palaces, requiring regular psychological evaluations for security personnel and implementing buddy systems that made it harder for individual guards to act alone. Tommy's story, also inspired changes in how law enforcement agencies handle child witnesses. His testimony had proven that young observers could provide crucial evidence when properly supported and protected throughout the legal process. Training programs were developed to help investigators work more effectively with child witnesses while maintaining the integrity of their testimony. 5 years after the trial, Detective Rodriguez visited Tommy at his middle school to speak to his class about careers in law enforcement. Now 13 years old, Tommy had grown into a confident teenager who still possessed the same sharp observational skills that had made him famous. "Do you ever think about becoming a detective when you grow up?" Rodriguez asked him during her visit. Tommy considered the question seriously before answering. "Maybe," he said with a smile. "But I think I'd rather be a teacher like my mom. She says that helping kids learn to pay attention to the world around them is just as important as catching criminals." The case continued to influence legal proceedings and security protocols for years afterward. Fletcher served 12 years of his sentence before being released on parole, his life forever changed by the choices he had made and the child who had witnessed their consequences. Tommy Martinez grew up to become exactly what he had predicted: a teacher who inspired his students to observe the world carefully and always tell the truth about what they saw. He rarely spoke publicly about his role in the Fletcher case, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves, just as they had on that sunny afternoon in Riverside Park. The stolen artifacts remained safely displayed in the Palace Museum, where a small plaque acknowledged the recovery efforts. Visitors often asked about the story behind the plaque, learning about the young boy whose sharp eyes and honest testimony had helped preserve cultural treasures for future generations. Years later, when Tommy's own children asked him about the famous case that had made him briefly famous, he would tell them the same thing his grandfather had taught him: that doing the right thing is always worth it, even when it seems scary or difficult. The truth, he would remind them, has a power all its own, and sometimes the most important observations come from the most unexpected sources.